Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Asphalian's webinar, How are APIs regulated in Europe? Key requirements for non-EU manufacturers. Before starting, a couple of things to take into consideration. This webinar will last for about 30 minutes. In case you have any questions, please submit them in the chat and we will reply to them later by email. We will also send you the presentation, as well as the link to the recording shortly. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Carlos Domingo. He is Associate Business Development Manager and CMC Service Lead. He holds a degree in pharmacy and a master's degree in drug discovery from the University of Bath. He has solid experience in laboratory training, microbiological techniques, and instrumental analysis, with a strong focus on scientific methodology, practical education, and critical thinking. His background combines scientific expertise with a strong interest in innovation in the healthcare sector, particularly in the discovery and development of new medicines. In today's webinar, Carlos will review the key European requirements that API manufacturers should understand when supplying products to the EU market, as well as common regulatory challenges that may impact market access, customer onboarding, and compliance. And now, Carlos, please.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. In this session, I would like to give you a practical overview of how active pharmaceutical ingredients, or APIs, are regulated in Europe, with a particular focus on non-EU manufacturers. The main idea is that I would like to explore is that supplying to the European market is not only about manufacturing quality. It is also about demonstrating control, supporting regulatory compliance, and fitting into a tightly supervised medicinal product supply chain. So this is not intended to be a detailed legal lecture. Instead, it is a practical market access perspective on what European customers and authorities typically expect from API manufacturers located outside the EU. Before moving into today's topic, let me briefly introduce myself and also give you a short overview of what we do at Asphalian. As my colleague Micah said, my name is Carlos Domingo, and I am part of the CMC team at Asphalian. Actually, I am the commercial responsible for the CMC service. At Asphalian, we provide end-to-end regulatory support across the full product life cycle, from early development up to regulatory strategy to dossier preparation, market authorization, and post-authorization support. Within the CMC area specifically, we support activities such as gap analysis, feasibility assessment, strategic CMC consulting, CMC writing during development, registration, and lifecycle management. So from a practical perspective, our role is to help companies translate technical development into a regulatory path that is robust, compliant, and workable across different stages of the product lifecycle. This is particularly relevant for companies supplying or planning to supply regulated markets such as Europe, where CMC, GMP, and regulatory expectations need to be aligned from an early stage. I will structure the session in 4 parts. First, I will briefly look at the EU framework for APIs. Second, I will discuss what non-EU manufacturers are expected to demonstrate in practice. And third, I will move to implementation, oversight, and supply chain control. And finally, I will highlight some common failure points and what good looks like from a compliance perspective. The objective is to leave you with a practical understanding of where regulatory expectations really concentrate. The first key message is that API compliance in Europe is fundamentally a market access issue. Even if the API is manufactured outside the EU, it becomes part of a regulated medicinal product supply chain. That means the manufacturer is not assessed in isolation. It is assessed in the context of how that API supports the manufacture, regulatory dossier, quality control, and eventual release of a medicinal product for the European market. In practice, 3 concepts matter a lot here: GMP equivalence, traceability, and regulatory readiness. GMP equivalence means that the manufacturing site must operate at a standard that is acceptable from an European perspective. Traceability means being able to follow materials, suppliers, batches, changes, and distribution steps in a reliable way. And regulatory readiness means being prepared to provide the right documentation, support audits, answer customer questions, and manage changes in a way that does not create downstream regulatory problems. So the key idea is simple: non-EU location does not reduce EU expectations. The second key message is that the European system is built around evidence of control, not just a statement of compliance. From a practical perspective, the EU framework combines legislation, GMP requirements, guidance, and most importantly, the company's own procedures and controls. In other words, it is not enough to say that the site follows GMP. The company must be able to demonstrate that it is actually implemented, sustained, and documented. This is why authorities and customers focus so much on documented controls, reliable data, and inspection readiness. From API manufacturers, one of the central operational references is ICH Q7, which remains highly relevant in the EU context. But companies also need to think beyond the text of the guideline. What matters in practice is how well the quality system is implemented, how deviation also need to think beyond, are investigated, how changes are managed, and how data are protected, and how consistently procedures are followed. So when we say the EU expects control, we mean operational control that can be demonstrated through records, system, and behavior. What do EU customers and authorities typically expect from the non-EU AP manufacturers? Well, at a high level, they expect a mature and transparent quality environment. This includes a robust pharmaceutical quality system, GMP-aligned operations, good data integrity practices, effective change control, traceability across the supply chain, and a general state of inspection readiness. A practical point here is that European customers do not just qualify a manufacturer once and then forget about it. They usually expect ongoing visibility. That may include supplier qualification packages, responses to audit findings, notification of changes, update GMP information, and a support for regulatory submission when needed. This is why the phrase on the slide is so important. Compliance must be demonstrable. In other words, technical capability alone is not enough. A company may manufacture a high-quality API, but if it cannot demonstrate control through documentation, communication, and oversight, that can still become a barrier to supply. Importation adds another important dimension, because once the API enters the European supply chain from outside the EU, scrutiny increases. This is not simply a logistic topic. Importation creates an additional regulatory control point. EU importers and finished product manufacturers need to be able to justify that the API source is acceptable, appropriately qualified, and supported by the necessary documentation. In practice, this often means supplier qualification, export-related documentation, quality agreements, and in some cases, written confirmation requirements for APIs used in human medicines, depending on the country and the regulatory situation. It is also important to remember that EU authorities may inspect sites outside the EU, so being geographically distant doesn't mean being used outside the European oversight. Another practical implication is that weakness in communication at this stage, missing documentation, unclear responsibilities, delayed information, can quickly affect supply continuity. In addition to GMP compliance and importation requirements, non-EU AP manufacturers should also understand how their active substance is represented in the EU regulatory documentation. A common mechanism is the ICMF, or Active Substance Master File. These allow the API manufacturer to submit detailed confidential information on the manufacture and control of the active substance, while still supporting the medicinal product dossier of the applicant or marketing authorization holder. A second important route is the CEP, or Certificate of Suitability. Where applicable, this confirms that the quality of the substance is suitably controlled by the relevant European Pharmacopoeia monograph. This links directly to the role of the European Pharmacopoeia, which acts as a common quality reference in Europe for many substances and specifications. A very important nuance that these tools are not interchangeable with GMP compliance. They support the dossier and quality documentation strategy, but they do not remove the need to demonstrate GMP control, data integrity, supply chain oversight, and change management. A very important point, and one that has become increasingly relevant over time, is that the whole supply chain matters. When companies think about compliance risk, they often focus mainly on the manufacturing step. But in reality, many weak points arise outside the direct production. That is exactly why the slide says that weakness links often sit outside production. Examples include inadequate supplier qualification for raw materials, poor oversight of contract laboratories, insufficient control of storage or transportation condition, weak distribution traceability, or delayed customer communication when a change occurs. From our European perspective, regulators and customers increasingly expect end-to-end oversight. That means understanding not just how the API is made, but also how the broader chain is controlled, documented, and monitored. So if the site itself is strong, but the surrounding system is weak, the compliance risk can still be significant. In practice, the most common failure points are usually quite predictable. One of the most frequent mistakes is assuming that local GMP approval or local regulatory status will automatically be accepted by European customers. This is often not the case. EU customers usually want their own qualification approach and their own assurance of control. Other recurring issues include weak documentation practices, poor change notification, limited oversight of contractors, or gaps in traceability. And these are not only theoretical concerns. They can lead to very practical business consequences, such as audit delays, customer concerns, and supply risk. From experience, poor change communication is especially important. A manufacturing change that seems manageable internally may have direct implications for a customer regulatory dossier in Europe. If the customer is informed too late, what starts as a quality or operational issue may quickly become a regulatory and supply issue. So what does a stronger and more sustainable compliance model look like? In simple terms, it combines understanding, control, communication, and readiness. First, companies need to understand EU expectations, not just their own domestic rules. Second, they need robust operational control through a functioning quality system. Third, they need to manage changes in a disciplined way and communicate quickly with customers where there may be a regulatory impact. And fourth, they need to stay inspection ready in terms of record oversight and data governance. This is why the slide said that compliance supports continuity. A mature compliance model does not only reduce inspection risk, it also supports business continuity, customer confidence, smoother onboarding, and fewer interruptions when changes occur. In that sense, compliance is not just a regulatory obligation, it's a business enabler. So to summarize, I would like to highlight 3 takeaways. First, EU API regulation is really about demonstrable GMP control. It is not enough to claim compliance. Companies must be able to show evidence of it through system, record, and consistent practice. Second, non-EU manufacturers play a critical role not only in quality, but also enabling compliance and market access for the European customers. Their actions can directly affect customer qualification, regulatory submissions, and supply continuity. And third, supply chain oversight is now essential. European expectations go beyond the factory and increasingly cover the broader network around the API. So if I had to summarize the whole session in one sentence, it would be this. Supplying Europe successfully requires quality, transparency, and control, and also understanding EU peculiarities. Thank you very much for your attention.